Hey guys, recently at one of my Bible studies, the subject of tithing came up. As you know, this is a very hot button subject in the church, and many people sitting in the pews have been hoodwinked by greedy pastors over the subject. We had a pretty good discussion at the Bible study, and I recorded it, so this is what was said.
Okay, so we're back at the Sunday evening Bible study, and I have a few of the members with me. I have Ray and Laura, Debbie and Donna, and we're going to be talking about tithing today. So, Debbie, I think you had a question on that subject?
Yes, actually, I've been raised in the church and have learned different things about tithing all over the map, starting with, watching a video at my dad's church that it was 10% that we were to give. And I remember being very convicted because at the time I only gave $20 and thought I was really doing a great service to God if I gave him $20, and remember really being convicted to do more by this video that my father had played in a church service. But later on, my husband and I ended up being members and eventually on the board at a large denomination. And there we were told that to be a member, we had to sign up to give 10%, but to be on leadership, because that was such a honor position in the church, that we needed to give at least 20%, if not more, and sign a pledge stating that we would do that. And so I have always wondered exactly what is the biblical position on tithing.
Well, first of all, let me just say that tithing was for the Old Testament Jews. It's not for the church. Those people who teach that tithing is for the church, it's wrong. First of all, this is a classic case of failing to rightly divide the word of truth. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15 says, and these are teachers, who are confusing national Israel with the church. We need to call this whole tithing thing for what it is. It's a scam and it's a shakedown, all right? You have men like Creflo Dollar who say that people who do not tithe should be shot. And most of the teachers who teach the tithe, these are guys who are living like kings and queens. A lot of the women, too, who teach the stuff, they're living like kings and queens, and their lifestyles are paid for by those who are struggling to pay the tithe and pay their bills and everything else. I mean, you look at these guys on television, with their million-dollar mansions, flying around in million-dollar jets and cars and, their jewelries and clothes and everything else. These guys are just living high on the hog when you have people giving them everything that they've got. Now let's go back to scripture. First of all, the tithe, as I said, was for national Israel. Okay, it was not given to the church. When you go to Leviticus chapter 27 verses 30 through 32, Deuteronomy chapter 14 verses 22 through 27, and verses 28 through 29, you see that the tithe was supposed to be seed and fruit and herd and flock and grain and new wine and stuff like that. It was given, as I said, as a part of the law of Moses and specifically to the Jewish nation. Nowhere in the New Testament does it command believers to give 10%. When you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, Paul, he speaks about when collecting for the poor saints in Jerusalem, Paul told the Corinthians to set aside their offerings as God had prospered them. You see, he didn't say set aside 10%. He said just set aside as God had prospered you. And the classic verse having to do with how we should give in the church is 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7, where it says, every man, according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. So nowhere in the New Testament are we commanded to tithe. Nowhere. It's a scam. It's a shakedown. As I said, it's being preached by men and women who are living high in the hog and who are not rightly dividing the word of truth. These people are greedy for money. Okay, these are greedy dogs who want your money, who want to live high in the hog. One of the scriptures that they use, of course, is in Malachi chapter 3, verse 8, where it says, will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? And God says, in tithes and offerings. And now, what's that whole scripture speaking about? Well, the Jews, of course, had not brought the tithes and offerings, those prescribed by the Lord, to fund the theocracy, by taking care of the Levites and the priests and religious festivals and the poor, okay? And in not paying their tithes and not paying their taxes, they had robbed God and also themselves, because he had withheld his blessings from them. So that's what God is talking about when he says that you have robbed me, is that the Jews had not brought the tithes to the temple, okay? Because that is what the Lord used to take care of the poor and the Levites and the priests and everything else. So when the church leaders stand up and say, oh, well, you're robbing God by not giving your tithe. That's a lie. He's confusing, or they're confusing national Israel with the church. We're not the same thing. All right, so the tithe is unbiblical. It was biblical for the Old Testament under the Jewish theocracy in Israel, but it is not biblical in the New Testament. Donna, you want to say something?
Well, I just wanted to mention also that the denomination that I came out of, which is the Assemblies of God, the pastor there would also preach a sermon at least 2 or 3 times a year on tithing, and what he would do is also quote that scripture. That would be the basis of the sermon, would a man rob God? And what it would do, at least for me and my husband, it would bring feelings of guilt, not convicting that, oh, we need to give more and more and more, but we would feel like we were in bondage to that it was something that we absolutely had to do. And while we were in the assemblies, when we wanted to become members, during our membership classes, that was one of the things that we found out, that we had to promise that to become a member of that church, we had to promise to tithe at least 10%, if not more. Also, It would bother me that, all this tithing, bringing the money to the storehouse, but yet the congregation, there were many people and families in the congregation that were obviously in dire straits, in financial need, but you could see the pastor being blessed, and he was not, I don't know, getting rich, but he was prospering off of the money, while some of the people in the congregation clearly were struggling.
It's a pyramid scheme. The guy at the top gets everything, while everybody else gets a little bit, or if don't get anything at all. Laura, you want to say something?
Yeah, 2 things. First thing I just wanted to say was, one time we had a guest speaker at our church, and I've always been a cheerful giver, no problem giving, but he said that you haven't begun to give until you've given the 10% tithe. And also, the second thing is that aren't the pastors, number one, being probably covetous, because they're not really trusting in God for provisions. They're trusting in the 10% church by putting their members under pressure to give 10%. You're not really, like, I'm not really allowed to be a member. I am a member, but right away the pastor came to us, of course, and said you have to give 10%.
Right.
And yeah, that's all I wanted to say. So I just feel like maybe they're a bit covetous themselves.
Yeah. I wouldn't say a bit. I'd say a lot.
Okay.
I mean, because again, when you look at the lifestyles of many of the people who preach this doctrine, I mean, these guys are living high on the hog. I mean, these guys are driving around in the fanciest cars. You have a man like Frederick Price, who brags that he has the pink slip for his Rolls Royce, and his Rolls Royce costs about $250,000. You have a man like Kenneth Copeland, who flies around, I think, in a $25 million jet. You have Paul and Jan Crouch, who live in multi-million-dollar homes in California. You have Creflo Dollar, who lives in a multi-million-dollar house in Georgia. And you have all of these big-name preachers. You have the Jesse Duplantis, you have the John Hagees, you have guys like Benny Hinn, all these guys living high on the hog, Paula White, and yet they're the people who are giving the money. A lot of these people are poor. A lot of these people are giving the last of what they have, and they're not seeing anything for all their tithes. All they're seeing is that they're becoming poorer and poorer, while these men are becoming richer and richer, these men and women. So it's a scam, it's a shakedown, it's completely unbiblical. Again, it was biblical for the Old Testament. It is not biblical in the New Testament. We're not under the law anymore. We're under grace, and we give as we prosper. We don't give under compulsion. Remember, God's not poor, okay? God doesn't need our money. We give our offering as a gratitude to the Lord, because He's blessed us. But we give as He prospers us. We should not come under any kind of a legalism and have anyone tell us how much we have to give if we're, if we really want to serve God and we really want to be blessed. No, God's going to bless us irregardless. He doesn't look at the money that we give. What he does is he looks at the heart. That's the most important thing.
Mark?
Right? So, yes, go ahead.
And it's not only big churches, like, we attend a small church, and it's other small churches as well. And maybe, give them a benefit of the doubt. Maybe they just haven't properly studied it, and they've just taught it maybe in seminary, and they're just teaching doctrines of men. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. As I said, I started off by saying a lot of it is just failing to rightly divide the word of truth, as 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 15 says. And unfortunately, that's exactly what you have. A lot of these guys, I believe, it's out of pure ignorance. But again, I think a lot of it is a lot of these guys know exactly what it is that they're doing. They know exactly what it is that they're doing. They're ripping off the flock of God because they love filthy lucre. And so, I think for a lot of these people, they know exactly what they're doing, and they just love the money and everything that comes with it. Debbie, you want to say something?
Well, I was just thinking that in a large denomination that we attended, we also understood that when they had their district council for the state, that the churches were set in a pecking order as to, like, the man who ran the mega church that gave the most to missions and also took in the most money in tithes and offerings. They would be set at the closest to the stage area, and it would be a big deal. Even people would have lunch with him and things. And then the churches that were maybe like in second and third, there was like a pecking order, whereas the smaller of God that were maybe had a smaller congregation, they would be set towards the back of the room. And really like in a pecking order kind of thing.
I just wanted to say that isn't one of the traits of a pastor is to not be covetous? I forget which scripture that is.
Yeah, 1 Timothy chapter 3, yeah, and also Titus chapter 1. A lot of these guys aren't pastors, they're wolves. Okay, they're just flat out wolves, and they're showing themselves for who they are. We shouldn't be surprised at it because, again, we're living in the last days, and we're going to see men wax worse and worse in the last days, and that's exactly what we're seeing. So it's only going to get worse, sadly. All right?
Okay.
That's it.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks.